Our panelists, they were just introduced. We have Brian Hansel of Change, Mark Fenigstein of Alta Motors, and Monica Mikaus of QEV Technologies. They do things that might initially appear not related, but it all gets down to electricity. They're all talking about battery-operated vehicles. Quite different, but all battery-operated vehicles, and they're got international aspirations, and they're really taking off in their respective spaces. So let's start with Brian. The company is pronounced Change, even though you might say it looks like Changi. And they are doing quite a lot with the utility vehicles, and they've got a deal with Ryder. Brian, your idea is to get beyond the idea of just a few test vehicles in fleets and really have wide adoption. So that's where we're at right now with what you're doing with Ryder. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think you and I have been at this for a while, Jim. So if you look at where the market has been, initially it was trying to validate whether electrification would actually make sense. And where we're at now, we've been lucky enough to actually bring a high-volume production product to market and launch it initially with Ryder. And so for the first time, we have a customer base that actually can choose to make a full transit. If you need to buy 1,000 vehicles, it's finally available, which up until now it just hasn't been.
So people can, if they want to try out an electric truck, they can do it. And right now in California?
Yeah, so in California, Ryder has our product in their rental fleet. So you'd like to rent an electric delivery truck, it's available today.
And Mark, you are, I would say, innovating in the electric motorcycle space, including off-road and competition. You've actually shown the taillights to some internal combustion motorcycles.
On a couple occasions.
Yep. Could you just talk about what you're doing?
Yeah, so Alta Motors really has two businesses. We're an electric vehicle technology company where we're developing new battery pack technology, motors, motor control, electronics, software, chassis tech, kind of everything that we need to optimize very light-duty electric vehicles. And then we've taken that technology, most notably the battery tech, and we've put it into currently competition-level off-road motorcycles, which sounds totally counterintuitive, but it's for some very good reasons. And those motorcycles have done really well. We've been able to compete at the national and international level directly against the best gas vehicles, and on occasion, like at the Geneva Supercross last year, win.
Electric motors, I talk about this a lot. They have 100% torque at 0 RPM. So off the line for things like drag racing, they're great, and they routinely beat. People tend to think electric cars are slow, but in reality, they're not. And I think Tesla has changed the perception of that. And certainly with motorcycles, you put an electric motor in a little lightweight chassis, the thing is going to fly, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we're all somewhat standing on the shoulders of Tesla. They really did shift perceptions, and the whole industry is benefiting from that. And now, happily, there are many other companies creating those same proof points across different sectors.
They have a new deal with Harley-Davidson. We could maybe talk a little bit about that later. But Monica, until recently, was with a Croatian-based company called Rimac, which makes supercars. They just introduced a vehicle that can go 0 to 60 in 1.8 seconds, if you think about what that would actually feel like on your body. And these are all electric supercars. But now she's doing something quite different with QEV Technologies. And the project they're starting on is converting jeepneys to electric power in the Philippines. So talk about that, Monica.
First, there is still some connection to this racing part of the world that I participated before. So QEV Tech is running one of the Formula Electric teams. And basically, this racing DNA that we have in the company, we used it to create products that are used for more mass market places. And we created an electric conversion kit to convert all of the jeepneys in Philippines. Currently, in Philippines, you have, only in Manila, 16,000 jeepneys. And if you convert all of them to electric, you're really reducing pollution, because those jeepneys are diesel-powered, of course.
And they're on the road all the time, right?
Yes.
Unlike a private car.
In Philippines, it's completely different because most of the people use public transportation. So jeepneys are the way they commute. And jeepneys are driving all of the time, and you can really feel the pollution in the city. And if you take a look about the whole Philippines, it's 200,000 of jeepneys operating. So if we convert only half of them, we already did a good job. And basically, Philippines is just like a business model that can be applied to many other emerging countries. Because in most of the emerging countries, if you go to like countries in Latin America, countries in Africa, they all have similar vehicles that can be converted to electric.
You mentioned possibly taxis in Mexico might be your next target.
So one of the discussions that we have are currently with operators of taxis in Mexico. And there are some plans to convert all of the taxis in Mexico to electric ones.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, there is a huge market and huge market potential for things that we do.
I was recently in China, where the government has basically decided that transportation is going to be electric. It's already been applied to the two-wheel market. But I think with government support in China, it's they have a lot of control over what happens in their market, and they've decreed that electric vehicles are the way to go. And at the Beijing Motor Show recently, it was every stand had electric vehicles on it. And Brian, just looking at the commercial space, it's hard to see how electric vehicles could be used for long-distance trucking. We still have some challenges there. But the space you're in, if people are familiar with the Sprinter van, Brian's vehicles are bigger than that, but they're used basically for that space. The short-term delivery around cities, how big a market is this internationally, and what countries would you like to see your... these are Chinese-made vans that Brian's company has, and they could be in use all over the world.
So, I mean, yeah, our focus is urban logistics, so depot-based logistics. So any place where you've got a centralized hub where you've got product that you need to get to a doorstep or a storefront is really our core market. And obviously, with the abundance of home delivery and the whole shift that we have, if something doesn't give, in my mind, in terms of putting clean vehicles running up and down all the residential streets, making them quiet, which gives us a lot of optionality to potentially even do evening deliveries, to take congestion off the road. Just a lot of really interesting things that could develop by having an electric drive system at the core of all package and ultimately people delivery. And again, for the first time, I think, if I look at the fleets that are in this space, they're taking it extremely seriously because it's about operating cost. And as we can all appreciate, beyond all the environmental benefits of electrification, at the core of it, it's a fraction of the operating cost. I mean, the cost of fuel is much cheaper, and the longevity of the vehicle is much longer. So if you think about an electric motor, it can last 500,000 miles, where a combustion engine wouldn't. So if you think about, obviously, the growing demand for local delivery, the need to be able to sweat those assets, operate them very cost effectively, and ultimately cleanly in your local neighborhood, we really think we're a first step in unlocking that.
If you could deliver the vehicle at essentially price parity with a diesel version of it, I mean, obviously the operating cost is so much lower that you would be an idiot not to recognize how much you're going to save on that.
Well, thank you, Jim. So I won't call anybody an idiot, but no, the opportunity really for the first time is here. I believe there has been a latent demand for this for years. There's been no supply. And so I think for the first time, people are going to obviously choose this because we are at price parity. The operating cost and maintenance and longevity of the vehicle is so apparent that there's a huge total life cost savings and driver benefits, environmental benefits. So it truly does become pretty obvious when you look at electrification at scale that it's not if it's going to happen, it's purely when.
That's true of all these spaces. It's not an if anymore, it's a when. So Mark, what's your plan for conquering the world?
Well, it starts with off-road, which is surprising.
Yeah, but at some point you've got to go on the road.
The short version, because we don't have a whole lot of time, is that the use case of off-road is actually surprisingly similar to the use case for urban mobility. And we're focused on everything that's smaller than a passenger vehicle, which today is largely two-wheeled vehicles, but in the future, as autonomy and as ride-sharing proliferate, We'll see some smaller four-wheeled vehicles as well, and we don't really care how many wheels there are. It's really about power, energy, and range. And so our next steps are to take what we've learned and what we've proven in sort of the most brutal and high-performance environment and start to move that into urban,
including with
sectors.
Harley-Davidson. But
That's right.
You
yeah.
can't say much about that.
I can't, but they do share our vision, and they see the same opportunity we do for personal transportation in urban environments, and that's really critical to their strategy as well as ours. So we were very excited to announce the partnership to develop electric motorcycles together in March.
Monica, you've mentioned the Philippines and Mexico. What about China as a market for you?
China is definitely a huge market, and the Chinese government is investing huge amount of money to make transportation go electric. And governments are even putting, regulations to make electric transportation in a city, forbidding gas-powered cars to enter the city centers and things like that. That is also happening part of in Europe currently.
Another big factor is that if you want to register a new vehicle, you can wait months if it's an internal combustion. If it's electric, you can do it today.
Getting the license plates in China can be really tricky if the vehicle is not electric. And maybe you will get, even if you get the license plates, you will get certain amount of days when you're going to be able to drive. So you're not going to be allowed to drive for the whole week, but for example, maybe for Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, you cannot use your vehicle.
Maybe in the time we have left, I just want to ask you each about charging, because people tend to think of the Achilles heel of the electric vehicle as charging and the long charge times and all that. I just want to ask you how you deal with charging in your respective fields. So, Brian?
Work down the line?
Yeah, so we have an interesting dynamic in that we have fixed routes. So every day you know exactly how far you're going to go. So in that environment, you can pre-predict the fuel tank that you need. So you put the right size battery on, so one charge a day. Typically in today's operations, then they would sit overnight and then so you have plenty of time at what's called a level 2 charging rate, relatively slow. It's very friendly to batteries. It's inexpensive to install. So that's a very practical reality in our application. All our vehicles do ship with DC fast charging also. So in case you have a unique scenario, and let's say a Frito-Lay as an example has 10 days a year where they have a big surge, like a Super Bowl and Thanksgiving, and different surge points. So where they may have to run 2 routes in a given day, and so with our vehicle, within an hour you could recharge. So having a combination of DC fast charging at a depot and standard level 2, we think gives maximum flexibility and really does serve the need.
Mark, do you use removable batteries? Because I've seen that on electric bikes.
Yeah, it's interesting. We actually architected our Redshift platform, our first bike, to have a swappable pack, and what we very quickly discovered was that charging is by far a more convenient solution than swapping. And as I look into the future, I think swapping is sort of an interim solution to the real problem, which is just not having enough range for your day. And the way I describe it is if your cell phone recharged in 5 seconds, that sounds great, but if you had to recharge it every hour, you'd have an iPhone, and you'd be really frustrated. If it takes 4 hours, but it lasts your whole day, you don't care that it takes 4 hours to charge. So the better solution is fitting sufficient amount of energy on the vehicle to last someone's full day. At the same time, we are also implementing fast charging solutions, and it's an easier problem to solve at our scale. You're not moving that much energy. So for us, at the motorcycle scale, a level 2 charger is actually a supercharger. It'll charge our bikes in about an hour. So I think the convergence of those two things have, for certain sectors, meant it's already retired. And it means, I think, in the next 3 to 5 years, range anxiety will essentially be eliminated.
And Monica, you working with the jeepneys, there's only like 3 of them in Manila now, so you don't really have that issue yet. But
there is issue for the future, and we are definitely thinking about how to solve it. So our sister company, QEV Global, they're actually offering the full service of making the infrastructure. And in parallel with us making conversion of jeepneys, they're doing the supporting infrastructure for the city. So the infrastructure will be done for the routes where jeepneys are going, so jeepneys will be able to recharge. And that's definitely one of the issues with all of the electric cars. We need to have supporting infrastructure if we want to go electric.
So I think there's sort of like taxis, so they could have a centralized charging depot, right? They could all be located in one place.
Yes, definitely. With taxis, that's the case. But with the jeepneys, since they're operating in many different areas and they're traveling in different directions, there is certain infrastructure that has to be divided to certain places. And that's what we are starting to do now in Manila, because it's much easier when you have jeepneys because they have the same routes, so you know where you need to place the charging station.
All right, we're not McKinsey and Company or anything, but we can prognosticate on our own. But when will electric vehicles take over when will all the vehicles in the world be electric? Brian, you have a thought on that?
I would say comfortably in my space, it's by 2025 you will not be producing an IC engine, is my prediction.
How about in your space, Mark?
In our space, yeah, I think it's a similar horizon. It's somewhere between 5 and 10 years. Well, actually, depends on what you define as our space. Within the premium Western and developed markets, I think it will not make performance sense to make ICE engines. Now, I look at our new partners, Harley-Davidson, and there's definitely a set of their customers that are going to continue to buy
bring this up.
gas bikes for a long time.
I'm sure there's a segment of their customers who said the idea of an electric Harley-Davidson is like absolute heresy.
They were surprisingly receptive to it. Harley ran an experiment in 2014 with a fleet of about 40 electric Harley-Davidsons, and the reception from their audience was super positive to don't really care as long as you keep giving me the bikes that I want. There wasn't much negativity at all, and I think that's really promising. I mean, I look at the environment we're in right now versus just 3 or 4 years ago is night and day, and it's really a world that's now receptive to the idea of electric and just waiting for it and expecting cost parity or superiority, performance parity or superiority, and utility parity and superiority. And as soon as you deliver that into a sector, it's not sort of a smooth, slow curve. It's an overnight flip, and that's going to happen sector by sector, I agree, in the next 5 years.
Actually, Monica, I wanted to tweak this a bit for applying to your former company, Rimac, in Croatia. They can build a supercar that can go 0 to 60 in 1.8 seconds. You're getting to see in the supercar world this idea that electric actually does it better, or hybrid. And it would seem kind of astonishing that these companies based on producing these big V8 powered or V12 powered vehicles are suddenly looking at electric, and Aston Martin or McLaren or these other companies are actually looking at electric now. So you think the whole supercar space is going to be taken over with electric and hybrid vehicles?
Definitely.
Definitely,
I would say so.
And that
would happen in the time span they mentioned. So I think in the next 10 years we will have them all electric. But with the things for emerging countries and minibuses, unfortunately, I think it will take a little bit longer, at least 20, maybe even more.
Well, they have this phrase in the third world. It's called "under the whirring fan," where you have to, figure out the bureaucracy of how to make things work. And you were talking about that backstage.
Yeah, it took like 2 years for us to have like 3
tea
jeepneys.
and meeting with officials and all that kind of stuff. Hopefully we have a little bit more time.
I do.
That's great. Maybe they're not giving us the hook just yet. But yeah, the electric vehicle space, I mean, I've been writing about it for about 30 years, and it was always like, in 10 years it's going to happen, in 10 years it's going to happen. The joke with fuel cells is that it was always 10 years in advance. But you mentioned Formula E earlier, and your company is actually doing a Formula E team. And for those who don't know, Formula E is electric vehicle racing. It's now happening all over the world. There was a lot of thought that it's not going to work for racing. The engines don't make enough noise. They're going to have to stop and recharge in the middle of the race. And currently they do. They actually switch cars in the middle of the race. But I think within a year, that's not even going to be necessary. And certainly I've attended 2 Formula E races, and they were very well attended. And all those objections don't seem to be happening. And I think probably we're going to see car racing that's not only electric, but autonomous and driverless. Isn't that a trip?
It's already happening with the robo race coming.
Yeah. So I don't think there's, as we mentioned earlier, I don't think there's any doubt that the whole automotive world is going both electric, autonomous, and adding a third element, connected. And I'm actually working on a book called The End of the Road, which looks at what's going to happen when all these things hit together. It's extremely disruptive in the sense that the whole car market and everything we know about cars, from car racing to motorcycles to service stations to dealerships to taxi driving, all that stuff is going to change in major ways, in ways they haven't changed in more than 100 years. So we're all in a space where that's the dominant reality, but I don't think it's really sunk in yet. But
it will.
We're sort of ahead of the knowledge curve in that people don't realize that all this stuff is going to hit at the same time. And I think people are just deciding what they think about autonomous cars. And I do think the autonomous timeline is a little bit further out than people think it is.
Yeah.
What do you all think about that? Because I think electric and autonomous go together. If you look at the idea that electric vehicles can actually go and park themselves and start charging themselves, there's a lot of synergy there. Any of you, is autonomy, do you think it's going to happen quickly?
I think there's probably too much autonomous knowledge and expertise in the crowd. I'm going to stick my foot in my mouth and say the wrong
Oh yeah, they
thing.
probably all know more than we do.
No, I'm sure it's going to happen. It's only a matter of time because, again, with autonomous vehicles, there will be a lot of regulations that have to be changed, and it would be hard to have autonomous vehicles and regular vehicles on the road together. So certain things are going to have to change, and this will take a bit more time than switching completely to electric.
We'll have an electric world before we have an autonomous
I'm
world.
sure.
I think so.
I'm
I
pretty
agree
convinced
with that.
of that.
I think the good news for a lot of us, though, is that we can actually be agnostic to that, right? Whether it's a human driving it or a computer driving it, it still needs the same battery, motor. You know, the infrastructure there is the same. So if that's what you're developing, then you're positioned for any of those outcomes on almost any timeline.
The important thing, though, with both electric and autonomy, we've gotten to the point where we're no longer talking about demonstration fleets and test programs and introductions in the future. It's already started to happen.
Yep.
And it's already penetrating the mainstream at a small level at this point. If you look at the number of electric trucks on the road, it's still very marginal. Or electric motorcycles, it's not even 1% of the market, right? And electric taxis, there's hardly any of them on the road. But all these things are, the plans are in place. The horizon is set. It's going to happen, unless something happens that we don't know about. And on that note, I think we have to wind things up. Thank you, gentlemen. It's very stimulating, gentlemen.